Hi, I'm Felicia Harris, and this is my application video. So, for a previous assignment, I had the opportunity to conduct my own 30-minute long play therapy session, and throughout this video, I will be evaluating that experience. I am the second oldest of 10 children, so I had a relatively easy time finding a child for my play therapy session. And it just so happened that my 3-year-old sister Emery had been asking me to play with her all day long, so it worked out quite perfectly. However, when I was choosing which sibling to conduct the therapy session with, I did run into a couple of dilemmas, and there were a couple of things I had to consider before choosing which child. So, my parents are foster and adoptive parents, which means a lot of my younger siblings are adopted. And most of them have a variety of behavioral and emotional issues that resulted from their living circumstances before they came to my home and because of all of the losses they have endured. So when I was trying to choose which sibling to choose, I had to take into consideration those losses that they've had and the impacts that it's had on their emotional and just mental well-being. So Emery came to my family when she was just a couple of days old. I believe she was about 7 days old. And so besides visits with her parents for the first 6 months of her life, my family is really the only family she has known. Her parents both their rights ended up being severed at about 8 months, at which point she became a permanent family member of my family. And so, although like my siblings know they're adopted and Emery is aware that she is adopted, she's still quite young and can't exactly fathom the losses that come along with adoption. So that hasn't necessarily been a factor in her life and hasn't necessarily had an impact on her behavioral and emotional well-being and just state yet. So for this reason, I decided that Emery most likely had the least amount of behavioral and emotional problems, and she would be my best bet for having a sibling do these therapy session. So this was important because for the previous video, the assignment required that the child not be exhibiting any extraordinary behavioral or emotional problems. So for the setting in which I chose to have the therapy session, I chose to use Emery's room because of the abundant amount of resources and the great opportunity that it was. The room is shared between Emery and her two sisters, Willow and Blessing, who are 7 and 8. And when I reflect back on the experience, part of me definitely wishes I would have had another area to perform the session in. Since it was Emery's room, she was already comfortable and aware of what toys were in the room. Hence, she was more infatuated with the idea of the camera being present than the toys that were in the room. So if I could go back, I would have set the camera up in an inconspicuous spot before having Emery go into the room so that it wouldn't have wasted so much time or been as distracting. After I'd conducted the session, I read in our play therapy book that you're supposed to have the camera planted before and that the child isn't supposed to be aware of it. So I wish I would have read that before and known that before. And also another problem was I had to keep stopping the video and restarting it because like the application that I was using was stalling and turning off. So I definitely needed a better application to use to record it too, so it wouldn't have been as distracting in that way too. And then also other distracting things that were happening in that room is that I felt like because she knew what toys were in that room, she gravitated towards specific toys, and I think it would have been neat to have had an experience for her where she didn't know what toys were in there so she could be more playful and more explorative and adventurous. Also, throughout the session, Emery made several references to the fact that the toys were her sisters, and although I'm not exactly sure how much that impacted our session, I definitely feel like it predisposed the topic and situation to reflect her siblings, because throughout our session she made several comments about how the lunchbox we were playing with was Willow's and she wasn't usually allowed to play with that. So I definitely think that the fact that those toys were her sisters and that she's played with them before impacted our discussion for sure. Also, there were several instances where family members came up and knocked on the door, and there were also times where voices could be heard from the other room. Each of these instances were definitely a distraction and impacted the session. Several times she was like talking about how they were going to get punished for being disruptive, or that she was going to punish them, write them tickets, she said, which was interesting to hear, just her take on the punishment and the whole situation. However, it definitely directed our talk. So for future sessions, I would prefer to conduct this session in an isolated area where there are not so many distractions and that Emery is not already aware of and familiar with. So during the instances where Emery was distracted or the session was impacted by outside individuals, it was hard not to redirect the conversation. part of me, a big part of me, wanted to redirect her back to doing something that she was doing before the distractions came about, because I wanted to know what she was saying before and where that was going to lead. Nonetheless, in order to let Emery completely guide the conversation, I had to refrain from doing so. And I also had a hard time allowing her to lead the session at a couple of other points as well. While Emery was climbing on chairs or getting into her sister's things, I really wanted to redirect her and distract her with something else so that she would stop doing those things. And this initial response to redirect through distracting a child with something else is a trick that I've learned throughout the past couple of years. Specifically for babysitting or foster kids camps that I've worked at in the past, it is common when a child starts doing something that they're not supposed to do, and instead of saying, hey, you can't do that, which oftentimes makes the child want to do it more, I typically will distract them by being like, oh, hey, like, look at this, let's talk about this. And so that initial instinct and response, I had to be really aware of it and pay close attention so that I wasn't falling into that. However, I also was aware that redirecting is possible in this circumstance. If it was a dangerous situation, I would just redirect the way that she lets those feelings and expresses those feelings. However, I didn't necessarily come to a point where I felt like I needed to do that. So overall, I just had to pay attention to the fact that I wasn't redirecting when I just didn't like what she was talking about or wanted to get her back on track. So another area I struggled in was encouraging her independence. When children begin to struggle, my first impulse is to jump in and to help. So when Emery was struggling to open the teapot or attach the high chair and open the lunchbox, I really wanted to swoop in and help, especially because she was asking me to do so. So in each instance, Emery did manage to do the task on her own, and each time I had to tell her, no, in the playroom, you can do this task. Regardless, it was very hard to sit back and to watch her struggle through it. It was neat to learn, though, because I realized that swooping in and helping, which I felt like before, I was creating a relationship with the child through doing that, and I was showing them that I'm reliable. I learned that it's actually debilitating because I'm teaching her to be dependent and I'm not empowering her. So it was just a very interesting skill to learn and technique to watch play out. One of the concepts that I felt like was a strength was using non-evaluative statements through not judging. This was the first time I practiced using non-evaluative statements. However, I felt quite comfortable using the technique. Instead of responding with statements or questions which I usually use, I used reflective statements to ensure that they were non-evaluative. So for example, when she would say she was feeling a certain way, I would say, oh, you feel that way because, and it was interesting to slow down and just acknowledge her emotions in reference to what was happening. And hopefully through doing so, I not only helped myself to realize the connections, but I also hopefully helped Emery to also become more aware of her feelings in reference to the situation of what was happening. So another strength that I recognized while I was filming with Emery was my ability to match her enthusiasm. Typically when I'm talking to someone, it's natural for me to absorb their energy. So as a result, I'll walk into a room that's rowdy, I'll typically get more rowdy, or if I walk into a room where people are more reserved and quiet, I tend to just drop back and be kind of more reserved and quiet. So because I already typically do this with people I interact with, it was easy to be aware of Emery's enthusiasm and to match that. Also, I'm not sure how much it affected our relationship affected that, because I know Emery going into it, I could kind of like think ahead of how she was going to react to certain things. So I don't know how much of that prepared me or helped me in that area. But I definitely felt like my strengths were being able to match her enthusiasm and use non-evaluative statements. Another skill that I learned that I was kind of caught off guard by in the reading was not using we statements. So whenever I interact with children, I tend to use we statements so that my directions or corrections are not as harsh. Also, I use we statements to convey to the child that they aren't alone. So it was out of character for me to refrain from these actions. However, I can completely understand how using we would undermine teaching the child responsibility. Overall, I really enjoyed the activity and I was excited to learn these new techniques and to be stretched through the things that I felt were my weaknesses, like learning how to let her lead the conversation and learning how to not redirect. And moving forward, though, I am excited to use these techniques with children that I encounter in everyday settings, the ones that I work with and just meet along the way. I love the idea of teaching kids all the time through all interactions, so I can't wait to empower and encourage independence and love on children through using these play therapy techniques. Thank you for watching.